A good Erev Shabbos. A traveler from New York is walking down the street in London, and he stops at one of the fancy food shops on Oxford Street. He walks in, sees that everything looks good, so he orders a pound of lox. Ah, sir, you must mean our Nova Salmon Fumé. Yes, a pound of our finest. I'll get it for you. So the traveler says, okay, how about blintzes? Can I get a dozen blintzes? Ah, no, very sorry, sir, says the clerk, but we have wonderful crepes. I'd be happy to prepare a dozen for you. And the guy says, okay, one more thing. Chopped liver? You have chopped liver? Ah, sir, we have a wonderful pâté that I'm sure you'll love. And the guy says, fine, I'll take everything, and I'd like to get it delivered to my hotel room on Saturday, please. The clerk says, I'm most sorry, sir. We do not schlep on Shabbos. We're in the age of Amazon and Uber Eats and FedEx, and we're used to pretty much getting what we want, when we want it, and usually pretty fast. Until we heard about supply chain issues in the recent past, which pretty much just makes everything more expensive, we had a pretty good deal going. We were more or less able to get what we want when we wanted it. That's a wonderful function of the modern age. And yet, the Parsha of Eikev this week tells us about having everything we need with convenient one-stop shopping before the modern age, in the Promised Land, in the land of milk and honey, among other delicious foods. We can and we will have everything we need in Israel once we get there and settle it. Moshe Rabbeinu explains to us. Remember, this is part of Moshe's last address to us, the whole book of Deuteronomy, that is, Chumash Devarim. His last address as his life is about to come to a close, and we, the Jewish people, are about to cross the Jordan River into Israel and settle it and inherit it as the Jewish home that God has been promising for generations. God, your God, is bringing you into a good land. Moshe tells us, a land with brooks of water, fountains, and sources that spring forth in valleys and hills. Ki Hashem Elokecha meviacha el eretz tova, eretz nachlei mayim, ayanus, usahoimais, yotzim, bebika, uvahar. Not only that, it's a land of wheat and barley, vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, eretz chita, usaura, gefen, usaena, verimon, eretz, zeis, shemen, udvash. Sounds good already, just like that. No, but wait, there's more. This is a land in which you'll eat bread without scarcity, and you will not lack anything in it. Eretz asher lo v'miskenus tochel bo lechem, lo sechsar boy, and even more, you can mine iron and minerals out of its rocks. Eretz asher avaneha barzel, u'meharareha tachtzov nachashes. One more comment about the land in the last verse of the first aliyah of this week's parsha. It says, "Ve'achalta ve'savata uve'rachta es Hashem Elokecha al haaretz hatoiva asher nasan lach." You will eat, you will be satisfied. So then, bless God, your God, for the good land that He gave you. This is the basis for grace after meals, including the expression of thanks for the land itself that Birkat Hamazon contains. Now, what's the best thing of all about being in Israel? Walking in the Promised Land, the warmth of the people, shawarma, falafel. Rabbeinu Bachya has an interesting comment. He maintains that the weather in Israel is an ideal combination of all 6 types of climate that are found around the world. That's why these verses that we just mentioned mentions the land 6 times. 6 mentions of land for 6 types of climate, all of them found in Israel. And the 7th mention of the land at the very end there, the 7th mention is for Yerushalayim itself, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, where all these come together. Yefei Nof, like it says in Tehillim, beautiful weather, he says, is found in Yerushalayim more than anywhere else. Abarbanel says the Torah is listing here the outstanding produce and resources of Israel, and at the same time, it's really talking about the most essential ones. It doesn't mention apples or other such fruits, but stresses those kinds here in the verse that are the most healthy and sustaining of life. That's what leads the Abarbanel to say that Israel is uniquely self-contained. You don't need to import anything into Israel. You can live just fine on what's there. That's the idea that nothing is lacking as the verses have emphasized. Some countries have wealth but little grain to make bread into. As we followed the global inflation and food shortage problems this year when Russia and Ukraine could not export their grain, we've seen that not much has changed over the years. In Abarbanel's time, he was talking about Venice as an example of a wealthy city that was dependent on grain imports to feed its people. Today, Egypt imports 2/3 of its wheat to keep its people fed, and Lebanon about half. So now, as then, apparently, some countries are really up the creek when grain imports slow down. The Rishonim, the commentaries in the time of Rambam and Rashi, about 1,000 years ago or so, darshan the verse that talks about water and fountains and springs as meaning those who live in higher elevations will not need to descend, and those in the valleys will not have to climb to get the water that they need. While Israel certainly still pays attention and uses its water resources very wisely and watches it very carefully, with the advent of desalination and drip irrigation and hydroponic farming and so many other innovations in clever and efficient water usage, you have to say that the blessings of the verse are welling up, so to speak. The Ramban, Nachmanides, contrasts the sources of water in Israel to those of Egypt. There in Egypt you have a river, the Nile, that feeds all the agriculture, the livestock, so the people came to worship the river as a god. In Israel, people learned to put their trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who causes all the sources of water to be, along with all the springs, the rain, the Tahom, and all the other places where we get water. It's also an interesting side note to observe that since so much of society in Israel was agriculturally based, those very terms we're talking about in these verses about the blessings became the benchmarks for everything else. In Jewish law, there's a unit of time, how to measure time. It's called Kedei Achilas Pras, how long it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread. There's a standard size of impurity, Kasa'ara, the size of a barley grain. Akazayis, the volume of an olive, is a measure of amount of food that you would need to eat to fulfill a mitzvah, like eating matzah on Pesach. A groigros, the bulk of a dried fig, and so on. The Kli Yakar notes an interesting similarity in words in the passage we're discussing. The notion of eating bread without experiencing what we would call today food anxiety, which is when you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Lo v'miskenus tochal lechem. You'll be able to eat your bread without poverty or anxiety over shortage. Kli Yakar notes that that's basically the same word as are miskenos. Remember, that's what we built in Egypt. Are miskenos leparo, storage cities for Pharaoh. There were grain storage places. Pitom and Ramses were those cities we built when we were slaves. Remember the agricultural crisis in Egypt way back in Genesis. There were going to be 7 full years and then 7 lean years, right, where nobody had enough to eat. A blight on the grain was going to cause a starvation, widespread starvation, if someone didn't take action. So Pharaoh, quite wisely, appointed Joseph, to be the minister in charge of the food supply and strategic planning, distribution, precisely because of food anxiety. Israel does not have that anxiety. Kli Yakar argues, and the Shach adds that the bread of Israel is so tasty, you don't even have to eat anything else with it. Sfas Emes adds a spiritual dimension. He says that usually when you overeat or focus too much on the material, a person can get caught up with and preoccupied with materialism. However, the bread of Israel does not have a negative effect like that on a person. You can eat Israeli bread without concern for being too overly engrossed in materialism. Nice. That helps us understand why we say in Ashrei, from Psalm 145, 3 times every day, Poteach et yadecha umazbia lechol chai ratzon. You open your hand and you satisfy the desire of every living thing. God can make us feel satisfied, full from what we eat, namely the bread of the land. So when the verse says v'achalta v'savata uverachta, it's not just a conditional statement, if you eat and you're full, so now you should bench, say grace after meals. It's a promise. When we eat the produce of the land that God gives us, the produce of Israel, we will be satisfied at all levels, not just our tummies, but our souls also. And then it's only appropriate that we express our thanks for all these blessings. That's the bracha of Israel, to be satisfied with what one has. That's certainly something that we should consider very carefully. At the end of the few verses that we quoted here, it talks about the stone and the minerals that lie within the land. Targum Yerushalmi explains that the quarries of stone in Israel allow construction of very solid buildings, in contrast to the clay bricks that neighboring countries use, which is obviously much less stable and more hazardous to the people who live in them. Later commentaries note that the blessing mentions stone and iron and copper, all of which are necessary for building a larger scale society. Gold and silver and gems would be nice, but they're luxuries. The ones we're talking about are necessities. Remember, it was only a few years ago that a huge deposit of natural gas was discovered in Israel's territorial waters. So the blessings of what's beneath the ground, as well as what grows from the ground and what can be mined from the ground, is still coming to fulfillment before our very eyes. All this is to say that the planful placement of all the praises of the land, all the rich resources, and a great deal of self-sufficiency that will be the lot of those who inhabit the land in a respectful and mindful way, brings us to the point of praising and thanking and appreciating God for all the bounty that the land offers us. The late, great Nechama Leibovich points out that the material success that Bnei Yisrael enjoy in the land God first promised us, then brought us to, should not lead to arrogance or self-satisfaction or, God forbid, to carelessness. In fact, if anything, should be the opposite. We should be that much more concerned, that much more attentive, that much more openly aware of our debt of gratitude to God for bringing us to this wonderful place and for giving us the opportunity to enjoy all its blessings. It seems paradoxical to human nature, so perhaps this success and well-being was a kind of a test, a chance to raise ourselves up, even amidst plenty, even amidst material success and sufficiency, to make ourselves nevertheless more humble rather than more arrogant, more thankful and praiseful rather than more oblivious and spoiled. The challenge goes on, the challenge continues, and as even further riches in the land are realized and developed, we can mine the depths not only of the land but of our own selves and of our own souls to find the gratitude and the humility of those who enjoy rich blessings and awesome divine bounty. Perhaps this applies to all of us, whether we live in Israel already or even also to those of us who are not yet there. And for all of us, wherever we are, we note that this Shabbat is Shabbos Mevarchim, in which we bless the new month of Elul, beginning next Shabbos. The reappearance of the moon in Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, will take place next Shabbat morning, 8:16 a.m., with 5 parts. Dem Moiled wird sein in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, dem Kumdiken Shabbos Kodesh in der Früh, 16 Minuten nach 8 Zeger, mit 5 Chalokim. Rosh Chodesh wird sein Shabbos und Sonntag. By next Shabbos, we'll already be into Rosh Chodesh Elul, the time of Ani LeDodi VeDodi Li, I am my beloved's, my beloved is mine. The initials of those words from Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, spell out Elul. The month of Elul, a time of very opportune closeness between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. May we all find the wisdom and motivation to make the very most of these precious days, and may we all be inscribed and sealed in the book of life for a happy and healthy and successful new year. Shabbat Shalom.